To what extent has technology and science risked meaning in our world? Has it made the problem of nihilism, of a kind of abyss of meaninglessness, even more dire for our society, for ourselves? In this lecture video, we're going to look at the problem, as Keiji Nishitani explains it, of nihility, of the problem between science and religion and philosophy. Keiji Nishitani was a Japanese philosopher, lived from 1900 to 1990, part of what was known as the Kyoto School. Briefly actually worked with the Western philosopher Martin Heidegger, who influenced his work, and then published one of the greatest works of the Kyoto School, Religion and Nothingness, of what we will be looking at part of that in this lecture video. In this video, we're just going, though, to look at the problem of nihilism and what exactly causes this problem, and whether it really is a problem in the way as the West conceives of it. In the second lecture video, we'll look at his solution to this problem. Nishitani thinks that there has been this problem of religion and science developed by science, by the prominence, the development of science. So you have this contemporary, this recent problem of religion. And really by religion, he considers also philosophy and especially metaphysics to be part of this, where basically science views anything that is not strictly empirical, that does not strictly adhere to its scientific method as kind of religious. And because metaphysics deals with that which is essential natures, that which is deals with fundamental principles, those things which aren't necessarily scientific, right? Because metaphysics deals with things like what is being, what is the nature of being, whether there is a self at all, what is knowledge, right? And these things you can't just investigate by mere empirical matters alone, because we're looking at some kind of a principle which goes beyond the mere physical external world, but that tries to explain the physical external world. And so you have this contemporary problem of religion, he thinks, and that develops because science appears to be incompatible with the worldview and ontology, the kind of study or the doctrine of existence itself, which traditional religions have by and large made as their basis. He says, one often hears that religion and science each has its proper domain and task, and that the two need never come into conflict with one another as long as they remain confined to those original boundaries. This is inadequate. A boundary separates one area from another, and yet at the same time belongs to both of them. So he's saying, well, some people to try to address this problem where science wants to invalidate religion because, maybe a claim to of the soul or God or whatever else. These kinds of things are not necessarily empirically verifiable, and therefore you also can't say, well, there is no God because we don't see a God, because the claim by religion is, well, it's in another realm, right, which we can't see with our own eyes. And so some people that try to address this problem this science poses to religion say, well, look, we can use science to kind of explain the world and use it in an instrumental way. This is, due to the Enlightenment to some extent, this idea that as we learn more of the kind of nature of the world, we can get rid of kind of superstitions and things like that. And so we can still have maybe religion for personal reasons, to give ourselves meaning, or we can still have religion for spiritual reasons, and have these beliefs such that they don't interfere with scientific progress. But what Nishitani is saying is that to say that, well, you can have a boundary that separates religion and science is to not understand what exactly a boundary is, because anything that is separated by a boundary, that boundary is touching both of them, which means both of them are still influenced by each other. They're both understood in light of the other. Science as non-superstition, superstition as non-rational or something like that. And he sees this example in the case that you have this problem that has arisen. They're trying to say that religion and science each has a separate domain and task, and so they don't have to conflict with each other. They can remain in their separate areas, has failed because we have this problem still rearing its head. Now, this is due to science conceiving itself as an absolute. That science, like religion perhaps used to do, science conceives of itself as the kind of universal absolute truth, such that if something does not make sense according to its method, it is invalidated. And so everything is subsumed by the scientific process. He says present-day science does not feel the need to concern itself with the limits of its own standpoint, for example. The scientific point of view displays a tendency, probably an essential tendency, to overlook not only religion but philosophy as well. Science thus seems to regard its own scientific standpoint as a position of unquestionable truth from which it can assert itself in all directions. And so science is coming in kind of like a battering ram and just knocking down the door on science. And it's saying this is superstition, it's invalidated, same thing with philosophy, and therefore we have to do away with it. But what Nishitani wants to ask is, can there be a plurality of absolute truths? Can we say that science gives us absolute truths about the world, and yet we can have other absolute truths that might contradict the scientific absolute truths? He asks, is there a new way of looking at the absolute and the relative, according to which two absolutes could come into being conjointly? Is this utterly unthinkable? So he wants to consider a scenario to begin thinking about two kinds of absolute truths according to this difference between maybe the objective and the relative. So he says, consider the scenario. Consider a human throws a dog a piece of bread. Or I throw my cat here, Sky, a little toy mouse. Okay? Now, what's going to happen? Of course, the dog is going to jump for maybe the piece of bread and eat it. Sky here, if it's a specific kind of toy mouse, she's going to run after it and be super excited to play with it. Now, science is going to give us, first, perhaps a psychological explanation. So it's going to say, well, maybe with, let's say, the dog or the cat, certain things are triggered in the mind where it kind of acts according to certain tendencies based on maybe its nature, so instinct, but also its familiarity with those objects and what it's used to doing. But notice, though, that psychological explanation is ultimately reducible to another kind of scientific explanation, a biological explanation. So we can look at, well, this is why cats or dogs act in this way and human beings don't because of their biology. And we can say evolution, right, hinting at the role of instinct and so on. But then even that can be ultimately reduced to a physical-chemical explanation, another scientific explanation. And we say, well, really what happens when the dog chases after the bread or the cat after the toy mouse is that there's certain triggers with, certain kinds of atoms or whatever else. I don't know exactly what happens. But whatever happens that makes the dog or the cat act in the way that it does. But there's an entirely different kind of phenomenological explanation. Not a scientific one, a phenomenological one. Nishitani calls it the being in the world of the scenario. So he gets this from Heidegger. Now notice, if we talk about ourselves and how I interact with this glass of water here, and I drink this glass of water, we can talk about this interaction with this glass of water in scientific terms. We can talk about, well, what allows this to happen is the kind of atoms that make up glass that allow it to be solid, that hold liquid water, that then my eyes view this and something happens in my brain and says I want to reach out and grab this distinct thing and drink it, etc., right? The problem is this isn't actually our experience. Our experience of the world, just like the cat or the dog's experience of the piece of bread or the toy mouse, these experiences aren't actually done in a scientific way. Our experiences, as phenomenology wants to get at it, are done in a certain way with the way we view phenomena, we experience phenomena. So he says, the bread, dog, and man exist in their own proper mode of being and their own proper form, or the Greek eidos, a kind of nature, and that as such they maintain a special relationship among themselves. In the case of the dog, for instance, the piece of bread and the man belong to the dog's environment. And the same can be said of the man in his relationship to the bread and the dog. The respective properties, manner of movement, and physical shape characteristic of the human being and the dog are inconceivable apart from the special characteristics of their respective environments. So what happens here is, if we think about the actual experience of the dog or the man or whatever, we have an environment in front of ourselves such that the idea I should say something about perhaps Heidegger, who's influenced Nishitani here. Heidegger's conception of the mind of specifically human beings, of Dasein, beings that question their own being, is that the mind is situated and it is practical. So it is situated because the mind is kind of part of the environment. It's thrown into the world such that it is associated with objects. It's around them. It comes to immerse itself in the context of the situation. But it's also practical because the way it views the things is, in many ways, its use, its relation to the objects. And so I reach out for a book. I don't necessarily see the book as pieces of paper that are ultimately reducible to its, physical, chemical properties or whatever. Right? I view this book, and particularly perhaps this book, in a specific way that has to do with my understanding of books and my understanding of this specific book and how I relate to books, which is different from how you relate to books, which is why maybe when I walk into a library and I see a bookshelf, my understanding, my immediate intuition about that bookshelf is perhaps a bit different from yours. So there are these factors of the mind where our experience, our being in the world, these are connected. These are part of a kind of appropriation of objects, such that, yes, there's an environment around me, but when I reach out and I grab the glass of water, I'm kind of appropriating it in a certain way for a certain ends, which are to hold liquid water, right? To drink it. And as such, this is how I make sense of my being in the world. In these ways, how I interact with these objects. How I categorize them through my being. Now, none of this, though, again, none of this is what science is going to say how we relate to the world, because this is it's more qualitative, it's more existential. And as Nishitani says, my point here is rather that these controlling laws of nature, it's true, right? We can talk about how I relate to the glass or the dog to the bread, etc. We can talk about how the dog, there's a psychological explanation or a biological explanation or a physical chemical explanation, all of which are true. But Nishitani's point is that these controlling laws become manifest in living organisms as something lived and acted out in a sort of instinctive appropriation. This is the first glimpse at perhaps coming to conceive of there being a plurality of objective truths. Perhaps ones that don't necessarily go together, like the phenomenological explanation and the scientific explanation. So, how do we come to have scientific knowledge of the world? Well, he says there's two elements involved in the process whereby knowledge and technology become scientific. So, first you have an increase in the abstract and universal knowledge of the nature of the world. So you have a kind of, right, just, kind of pure numbers, think about physics, mathematics, etc., how mathematics kind of underpins physics. And we have this kind of non-intuitive sense about the world that physics tells us. Now, technology kind of appropriates it. It puts into action for certain uses this kind of abstract universal knowledge. Now, what happens is this increased knowledge, this abstract knowledge of nature, inversely ends up meaning an increase in freedom. So, the more we know about the world, the freer we are. Why? Well, I can, of course, say, well, there's a reason why I reach for the water and I drink the water, and the water is nourishing. And based on this kind of scientific understanding of the relation of its biology or psychology, whatever, to me, I can change how I react towards the water. And this can mean then I increase my freedom and to not be, merely subject to instinct, perhaps we can say. Now, human work and technological advancement involves a double relationship then, according to Nishitani, where greater obedience to laws of nature directly implies greater freedom from their bondage. Right? It seems paradoxical here. The greater we obey the laws of nature, the more free we are from the bondage of the laws of nature. He says, the higher we proceed up the chain of being, the deeper the reach of the rule of law. But at the same time, the more fully actualized the freedom of things that use those laws. In short, already in their mode of being as living things, the implication is at least faintly present that subordination to law directly entails emancipation from its bondage. The manifestation of the laws of nature and their utilization can be considered to come together immediately in instinctive life and behavior. Yet, insofar as that unity is merely immediate, the world of living things remains bound by those laws. So the idea is, again, I am freer to the extent that I obey the laws of nature, and yet the more I obey the laws of nature, the less I am bound by them. This is the kind of paradoxical nature of knowledge of the world, that the more I understand how things interact, the less I am perhaps like an animal, we might want to say, who kind of unknowingly carries out, acts according to instinct, which of course instinct is merely that application of the laws of nature. So there's a kind of distinction then between the instinct and the intellect. And the more I know in the intellect about the laws of nature, even though the more I actually then follow through with nature and what instinct is, there's still a distance where there's greater freedom from the bondage of instinct. It's one and the same, and yet distinct. And this is a feature that Nishitani is going to pick up, where you can have one and the same, and yet they're distinct. Now, to get back to the problem, though, humanity's production of the machine, its appropriation of the laws of nature through technology, has slowly begun to deprive itself of its very humanity. Here we see nihilism begin rearing its head. He says, when this relationship of reciprocal control between the laws of nature and the things of nature reaches its extreme in the machine, it does so on a field that goes beyond the original, natural ties between man and the world of nature. It is a relationship that breaks down the barrier between the humanness of man and the naturalness of nature, and in so doing is fully radicalized. But at the same time, a profound perversion takes place at this very extreme. An inversion of the more elemental relationship in which man took control of the laws of nature by means of the control that those laws wrought over the life and work of man. Here, the laws of nature come to reassume control over man who controls the laws of nature. So even though greater knowledge of the laws of nature gives us freedom, our appropriation of those laws of nature turns us into machines, whereby we become regulated. We become the same as anything else. This is the problem of nihilism, right? That there is no difference in values. Everything is the same. And if everything is the same, there is no meaning. There's no greater or lesser. There's no purpose. There's just doing what was always going to be done, which could not be done otherwise. Greater freedom, then, according to the scientific domination, right, rooting out of any religious or philosophical meaning, ends up mechanizing human experience. Because notice how this means, when we were talking about the phenomenological explanation of our experience, right? Well, what happens is the greater we obey the laws of nature, the greater that we make that our entire worldview, the less we're able to make sense of our own, qualitative experience of the world. Because everything becomes quantitative. Everything becomes down to a series of ones and zeros, right, of algorithms. And yet that's not how we experience the world. We begin alienating ourselves from ourselves. We lose a sense of purpose. Nihility conceives of nothingness as being, as a kind of thing that has a nature, in the same way that a glass has a nature, or human beings have a nature, an essence to it that makes it what it is. Nihility conceives of nothingness as an abyss which threatens our existence. It kind of opens up, swallows us in, and we fall into the black hole where there's no light anymore. Nihility is like a shadow then that lurks beneath our hobbies, why we do what we do, such that even if we enjoy doing something, if it were taken away from us, let's say I enjoy watching soccer and the World Cup. If I didn't have the World Cup, what do I do with my life? Or if I didn't teach philosophy or have a family, what would I do with my life, right? This idea that it is those things which give my life meaning, which give my life purpose. And nihility is always lurking around the corner, or it's like a shadow such that if it takes those away, if those disappear, there's no purpose to my existence. It's as if I'm not existing at all. As he says, nihilism takes its start from an awakening to a meaninglessness at the ground of the world and man himself. So what we have then is an inversion, Nishitani says. An inversion of controller and controlled that really exemplifies the problem of nihilism in our contemporary age. Now, on the one hand, you have rationalized one's life by science. You follow the scientific laws, you exemplify the laws of nature, and therefore you are free from instinct. Now, as we saw, though, the more you rationalize your life, the more mechanized your life becomes. Well, maybe perhaps to escape this mechanized alienation, to get meaning in our lives, we should perhaps turn to more passion and instinct. So live passionately, live instinctively. But what's the problem with that? Well, of course, instinct is subject to the laws of nature. So the laws of nature are inescapable, whether we want to turn to rational explanations, rational ways of living our lives, or more passionate, instinctive ways of living our lives, just that they're opposites. And we turn to the other when we're afraid of the nihilism of the other. But notice, both ends are subject to the same problem, the same nihilism, the same meaninglessness, where we have no uniqueness, we have no individuality, we have no greatness to pursue, because we're all just cogs in a machine in a sense. So he calls this a kind of duality of a life-oriented axis and a death-oriented axis. And we see this between the distinction between two different standpoints, a religious standpoint and a scientific standpoint. Now, from the religious standpoint, which he says originates from our search for purpose and meaning, the religious standpoint for life is spoken of as an ascent, right? That we kind of ascend to our purpose out of the depths of meaninglessness. He says, given such an orientation, the life of animate things was located a rank above the inanimate level of things. Along this same line, the notion of a gradual ascent to soul, spirit, and personality came about. An ascent that culminates in one final leap to the standpoint of religion as a personal relationship between God and man. Now, on the other hand, right, so the life-oriented access, we have the scientific standpoint, which of course invalidates religion. This is why we're in this problem. The scientific standpoint views death and nothingness then as a reduction. So he says, in contrast, the orientation that puts the stress on death is spoken of in terms of a reduction that proceeds backward through personality, spirit, soul, and life to arrive at inanimate things, where everything is considered to be based upon and reducible to materiality. And so we seem to have this kind of access where we want to ascend out of meaninglessness, which science seems to reduce our lives to. Yet what happens there is we're going to see we have a certain kind of relationship between God and man that then ends up also kind of taking away our individuality, just the purpose of what God has for ourselves. And then when we turn to religion, to science, it's kind of a fall from the ascent to a reduction of everything as a series of ones and zeros, to death in a sense, death of meaning, death of purpose, death of that which is greater than other things. Nishitani wants to reject this life-death duality. He wants to reject this way in which we think of the world, and we think of nihility, of nothingness. Nothingness as a kind of rejection of the ascent, a rejection of God. And God, purpose, as a rejection of nothingness. So he says we conceive of the world as being divided into subject-object relationships in the same way that I kind of, as a subject, I objectify then this glass, and I do with it what I want. I fully control it. Another way of thinking of this is the outer world versus the inner world, right? My inner world and my thoughts, and the external world and how I make sense of the external world. When we do this, when we divide the world into this kind of subject-object relationship, the world becomes a meaningless collection of objects. All of these objects are essentially the same. They're not me, right? I have thoughts, I have values, I have feelings, etc. But external from my mind, the world is just a collection of objects, which are ultimately all the same. There are two ways the West views this, and he's going to reject both of the Western views here. So he says, in the West, God is the ultimate subject, separating the world from itself, of which then humans relate to God as an object. Now, the problem with this, as we're going to see, is that if God is the ultimate subject, separating the world from itself, well then human beings become objectified, subject to God's will, and then we're stuck back in the same problem where we're just kind of cogs in a machine subject to what God decides. And we're, in a sense, alienated then from ourselves as human beings. Now, Western existentialists, people like perhaps Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, they view the self as in constant struggle with the world, between self and other, that they want to then embrace the ambiguity of human existence, of kind of being stuck between this constant relation between subject and object. And they say, well, the point is not to say objectify everything like science, or subjectify everything like some kind of religion might or philosophy might have it, but instead you kind of embrace the ambiguity of human existence, of both of this duality. You embrace the duality. But what Nishitani wants to do is reject duality. He wants to reject dualism. He wants to say, both first with the West, the Western conception of God, this dualism between God as ultimate subject and human beings relating to God as objects, reject that duality. And the existentialist account of the duality that they want to embrace, the ambiguity between self and other, reject that as well, that there is no duality. This is where Nishitani is going to turn to Sunyata, which is the Sanskrit word for emptiness or nothingness. That Sunyata is a kind of positive account of nihilism, of nothingness. He says, Shunyata is the point at which we become manifest in our own suchness as concrete human beings, as individuals with both body and personality. And at the same time, it is the point at which everything around us becomes manifest in its own suchness. Might it not be, then, that we need to revert to such a standpoint in order for the sort of relationship referred to earlier, in which subordination to the rule of law is at once an emancipation from it to come about properly? And is it not further the case that the possibility of human existence also properly emerges only in connection with the enabling of this relationship in its proper sense? So in the next lecture video, we're going to look at his response to the problem of nihilism and how shunyata is the answer.